It is April 73 AD. The Roman army has been building a ramp. For 3 months, 10,000 Roman soldiers have been constructing an earthen ramp up the side of a cliff in the Judean desert. A ramp 400 meters long, rising 100 meters from the desert floor to the walls of a fortress that sits at the top of a plateau with sheer drops on every side. The ramp took 3 months to build. The assault took 1 afternoon. When the Romans finally broke through the walls of Masada and entered the fortress, they found silence. 960 people, dead, every one of them, not killed by the Romans, killed by each other, by choice, by a decision made the night before when the walls were still standing and the ramp was not yet complete, and the last defenders of the last Jewish fortress in Roman Judea gathered together and decided that Roman slavery was not a fate they would accept. 73. The year that ended the First Jewish-Roman War. The year that produced one of the most debated, most contested, most psychologically complex stories in ancient history. By the end of this video, you will understand why 73 is not just the year Masada fell. It is the year that asks the hardest possible question about human freedom. What does it mean to choose when all the choices are bad? The vault is open. To understand Masada, you have to understand what had happened in the years before 73. The First Jewish-Roman War began in 66 AD, a revolt against Roman rule in Judea that started with taxation protests, religious grievances, and the accumulated resentments of a people who had lived under foreign occupation for generations. It escalated into full-scale rebellion faster than anyone anticipated. The Romans had not faced a revolt of this scale in the region before. The Jewish population of Judea was fighting not just for political independence, but for the survival of a way of life, a religion, a temple that was the center of everything they understood about their relationship with God. It was catastrophic for both sides, but catastrophic in completely different ways. The Roman general Vespasian, who would become emperor during the war, systematically reduced Judea, city by city, fortress by fortress. His son Titus completed the campaign. In 70 AD, Titus besieged and destroyed Jerusalem. The Second Temple, the holiest site in Judaism, the spiritual center of Jewish life for centuries, was burned to the ground. The destruction of the temple was so total that when the Romans were done, Jesus' prophecy was literally fulfilled. Not one stone was left upon another. The Jewish population of Jerusalem was killed, enslaved, or scattered. The revolt was over, except at Masada. Masada is a natural fortress, a plateau rising 450 meters above the Dead Sea on the eastern edge of the Judean desert. Herod the Great had built a palace complex on top of it decades earlier, stocking it with enough food and water for years of siege. The defenders who held it in 73 AD were a group called the Sicarii, Jewish rebels who had fled Jerusalem before the Roman siege. Under their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, approximately 960 men, women, and children had held Masada for 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem, conducting raids into the surrounding area and surviving on Herod's stored provisions. The Roman governor Flavius Silva arrived in 72 AD with the 10th Legion and auxiliary forces, approximately 10,000 soldiers in total. He surrounded the plateau with a siege wall 8 Roman miles long to prevent anyone from escaping. Then he began building the ramp. The ramp took from late 72 AD to early 73 AD to complete. It was an engineering feat of extraordinary ambition. Hundreds of thousands of tons of earth and stone moved by the labor of thousands of soldiers and Jewish prisoners of war, rising from the desert floor to the walls of the plateau. When it was complete, the Romans moved a siege tower up the ramp and used a battering ram to breach the outer wall. The defenders had built an inner wall of timber and earth. The Romans set fire to it. The wind initially blew the flames back toward the Roman positions. Then the wind shifted. The inner wall burned. By evening of that day, the breach was complete. The Romans withdrew for the night, planning to enter the fortress in the morning. That night, Eleazar ben Yair gathered the defenders of Masada together. What he said to them is recorded by the Jewish historian Josephus, the primary source for almost everything we know about Masada. Josephus was not there. He was a Jewish commander who had surrendered to the Romans earlier in the war and was writing under Roman patronage years later. His account of Eleazar's speech, in fact, 2 speeches, is a literary construction, not a transcript. Whether it accurately reflects what was said that night is impossible to know. What Josephus records Eleazar saying is this: that death was preferable to slavery, that the soul was immortal and would be freed by death, that the Romans would find no victory at Masada, no prisoners to parade, no slaves to sell, no submission to display, that the men should kill their wives and children first, then draw lots to determine who would kill the men, until one man remained to kill the last, and then fall on his own sword. This is what Josephus says happened. 10 men were chosen by lot. The remaining men lay down beside their families. The 10 went through the fortress, killing them. Then the 10 drew lots among themselves. 9 were killed by the one chosen. Then the last man, the last living person in the fortress of Masada, walked through the silence of 959 dead people, checked that everyone was truly dead, set fire to the palace so that the Romans would find no spoils, and fell on his own sword. In the morning, the Romans entered Masada. They expected battle. They found silence and fire. Josephus records that the Romans were struck not with the joy of victory, but with admiration for the dead. He records that 2 women and 5 children survived. They had hidden in a water cistern and refused to participate. They were the ones who told the Romans what had happened. They were the ones who told Josephus what they had seen. The question that Masada raises, the question that has been argued over ever since, is whether what happened that night was an act of heroism or an act of murder. The men who died by their own choice made a choice. The women and children who died beside them, did they make the same choice? Were they asked? Were they given the same freedom to decide that the men apparently had? The historical sources cannot answer this. Josephus does not make it clear. He presents the deaths as collective and consensual, but he was not there. He was writing years later, and he had every reason to present the story in the most dramatic and philosophically coherent way possible. The archaeology of the site, which was extensively excavated in the 1960s by the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, found human remains but could not determine the manner of their deaths with certainty. Yadin found 11 small pottery shards with names scratched into them, one of them inscribed with the name Ben Yair, possibly the name of Eleazar himself. These may be the lots used to choose the 10, or they may be something else entirely. The archaeology raises as many questions as it answers, and the historical source, Josephus, is a man who surrendered rather than die at Jotapata, where he reportedly organized a similar lottery that he himself survived, under circumstances he describes in ways that have made readers skeptical for 2,000 years. A man who chose to live is the only source for a story about people who chose to die. What is certain is this: when the Romans entered Masada on that morning in April 73 AD, they found the largest mass death in the history of their Judean campaign. They found a fortress full of the dead. They found 2 women and 5 children alive in a cistern. They found no resistance, no battle, no victory in the conventional sense. What they found was a refusal, the most absolute refusal possible, to be what Rome wanted them to be. Whether that refusal was heroic or tragic or both, whether it was freely chosen by everyone it affected or imposed by the few on the many, these are the questions that Masada leaves open. They have never been closed. Modern Israel has wrestled with the story of Masada for its entire existence as a state. The phrase Masada complex entered the political vocabulary to describe the fear of national annihilation and the willingness to die rather than surrender. Israeli military units used to be sworn in at Masada with the words, "Masada shall not fall again." That tradition has been questioned, revised, debated, just like the story itself. So, what is 73? It is the year that proves that history's most powerful stories are not the ones with clear answers. The story of Masada is not a story of triumph or defeat. It is a story of an impossible choice made by people in an impossible situation, recorded by a man who made a different choice, debated for 2,000 years by people who were not there. The Romans called Masada a victory. The Jews who died there called it something else. The 2 women and 5 children who survived called it what they saw. And we do not know what they called it because nobody recorded their words. What we have is a plateau in the Judean desert, 450 meters above the Dead Sea, where the walls of Herod's palace still stand, where Judean's excavations are still visible, where the 11 pottery shards are displayed in a museum in Jerusalem, and where the question that was asked on the night before the Romans entered has never been answered. What does it mean to choose when all the choices are bad? 73. The year Rome found silence where it expected battle. The year 960 people pressed the hardest possible question into the desert rock and left it unanswered for 2,000 years. If this story made you think, leave a comment. Was Masada heroic or tragic? Could it have been both? Subscribe to the Vault of Numbers. Every week, one number, one story history forgot to tell you. The next number in the vault? 480. A king took 300 men to a narrow mountain pass. He knew they would not come back. He went anyway. The vault remains open.